Welcome to Our Interesting Times with host Timothy Kelly, who interviews today's top alternative and revisionist thinkers.
May you live in interesting times.
My guests tonight are Paul and Philip Collins. They returned to discuss an article of theirs, Their Kingdom Come, Dominionism's Quest for Political Capital in the Emergent New World Order. Paul and Philip collaborated in writing The Hidden Face of Terrorism, and they both wrote The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. They are frequent contributors to Conspiracy Archive. Hey, how you both doing tonight?
Hey, doing well, Tim.
Doing pretty good, Tim.
How's the latest project of yours coming along? I know a while back you mentioned you're in the middle of a book.
Yeah, 470 plus pages now, and it's still climbing. We thought that the section over a little bit of humor here. We thought that the section that was going to be about UFOs was officially over, and that we could close that chapter out and say that we were done with that portion of the book. And then
you were kidnapped by UFOs. What happened?
No, we were kidnapped by Julian Assange. She did this Podesta email dump and ruined my day.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and everything. Because there's some correspondence there between Podesta and Edgar Mitchell, and Podesta has always had a weird fixation with UFO disclosure.
Oh, okay.
And it all fit the pattern of deception that we were looking at in that chapter, and the overlap between the UFO phenomena and the elite control agenda. Mm-hmm. And so we had to go in and we had to visit that in the book. And so we're working on adding that in and integrating that into the existing manuscript.
Yes.
And everything. So, I mean, it just keeps on growing and growing and growing, and hopefully,
Yeah, it's becoming for us what Spalding Gray's book was to him. If anybody's ever seen Spalding Gray's Monster in the Box, where he talks about his authorship of this book takes him forever to write, and by the time he was halfway through it, he said, "I hate it. I want to destroy it. I want to take it out and burn it, but I got to finish it first." And that's where I'm at. I'm either I'm going to kill it or it's going to kill me, but eventually it will be out, and there'll be more than enough material there to satisfy readers. They won't be dissatisfied. We apologize for the long wait, but like we said, we're well past the point of date setting, so to speak. We're not when it comes to writing this, we're not going to take the dispensationalist approach and set a date particular. It'll arrive when it arrives.
What's the working title again?
Invoking the Beyond.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah, and we don't have a full subtitle yet. I don't know if there will be a subtitle. There might be, but it just basically deals with the beyond, which is a narrative construct arising from what we dub the Kantian Rift, which is really just the arbitrary imposition of a disjunction between noumenon and phenomenon that was imposed by Immanuel Kant, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and from that rift between noumenon and phenomenon, the world of appearances and the world that is objectively real, you have this narrative construct known as the beyond, which is a nebulous force that dwarfs man epistemologically and ontologically, and it's kind of analogous to a Rorschach ink blot that the elite project upon that surface whatever force from beyond they want to use to compel nation states to abandon their national sovereignty and accept a managerial system, a technocratic managerial system, to basically address this issue of the beyond. And the beyond takes the many forms. It can take the form of environmental degradation. It can take the form of nuclear annihilation. And then, of course, it takes the form at a certain juncture of extraterrestrials and extraterrestrial forces from beyond. But in every instance wherever they invoke the beyond, invariably the solution that is posited by the elite is, of course, the dismantling of the nation-state system and the adoption of this global technocratic managerial system, the destruction of civil liberties, all in the name of protecting us from the unknown.
Basically, an appeal to our sense of insecurity.
The appeal to fear of the unknown.
And again, the problem with finishing this book is that it's not a topic that you can narrow down easily, because like Philip said, the beyond has so many different manifestations. Even with the GWAT, the Global War on Terror, terrorism and terrorist organizations had many going back to 2001, whether you're talking about Al-Qaeda or you're talking about ISIS or any of the other, different villains in that GWAT narrative, they have many of the characteristics of the beyond. They dwarf man epistemologically and just take on almost a ubiquitous sort of air to them.
Well, the fact that terrorism is not confined to the boundaries of any sort of nation state. It's just kind of
it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
It's strangely ubiquitous, and it has that noumenal quality to it, and everything,
And of course, this recent U.S. firm working on Pentagon contracts that were making these, these fake videos.
Bill Pottinger.
Yes,
out of the
Bill
UK,
Pottinger, which has a long history in the American deep state that just would call for a show all by itself.
Yeah.
The videos that they were putting out helped to add to the mystique and add to this sense that this thing is just beyond our experiential spectrum, and it just added to the fear.
Yeah. It was a $540 million contract to produce fake videos. Just the amount of money. I mean, that's just a drop in the bucket, but it just gives you the idea of how much money is being spent on these things. There's probably a lot of graft and corruption involved in that, embezzlement.
Probably.
Well, again, Bill Pottinger, they have a long history, going back in as far as deep politics goes and deep political practices, and has had a long-standing tie with the American deep state and everything. So there is, like you say, Tim, there's a lot of graft and there's a lot of corruption there. In this particular case, we're the topic that we're just tangentially touching on here, the terrorism as it relates to the construct of the beyond. Bill Pottinger really helped to add this sense. Add to the idea that terrorism is this this enemy, this faceless enemy that can be everywhere and nowhere at once, and it's just something that can't be dealt with through the means of conventional statecraft and conventional politics, and really the only way for us to survive it and to see its defeat is compliance, namely compliance to the establishment.
Mm-hmm. And that was foreseen as early as I guess it was Joseph Conrad, the secret agent, which is 1900 or 1901 about.
Somewhere in that avenue.
Yeah, where it's about.
Back.
Yeah.
Yeah. It goes back. It goes back a ways.
So, so you mentioned the deep state and parapolitics. That's kind of your field of study. And yes. I think both of you were journalists in past lives, if I recall, right?
Yes, we were.
So we're talking about the deep state and parapolitics and your study of it. What got you into that, and how important is understanding deep politics, conspiracies, conspiracy theory, or conspiracy fact, and understanding how the world really works in your estimation?
Well, with myself, and this is Philip. I have a bachelor's degree in communication studies and another bachelor's degree in liberal studies, and then a minor in philosophy. And in my studies of communications and mass communications, I broached the topic of semiotics. I was in a media criticism course, and we started discussing semiotics and basically the media's use of signs, of iconic logos, to convey certain messages and certain themes to the population. And what you've come to find out, and it's actually the theoreticians that you study are quite candid about this, is that the whole field of media is basically geared towards creating an illusion, creating specific narrative paradigms, and imposing it upon the audience and upon their perception of events. And that in and of itself can be conspiratorial. That in and of itself has a certain bit of intrigue and a certain bit of deep political tones to it. And so it's kind of that was what for myself, that was one of the reasons that I became so interested in the topic, was because of my studies in communications and mass communications. And also during my college career, I also studied science and religion, and the interplay between the two. And I came to find that with the science and religion, you have the dominant paradigm is scientific materialism and scientism, and I came to this, to see how the imposition of science upon the practice of government, how the imposition of science upon the societal models, using that as an approach to the management of a civil society, actually transmogrifies that civil society into a functional technocracy, or a society with technocratic elements, which, of course, in classical political terms is a rule by experts and a rule by scientists and technicians. And, of course, the modern mind, being chronocentric as it is, tends to view anything and everything that's described as scientific as somehow desirable. But the problem is that science, given the fact that it can only deal with what is quantifiably and empirically demonstrable, by the fact that it takes the quantitative approach to everything, it must jettison all other factors, the notions of the dignity of the individual, the notions of the intrinsic value of human life, morality, and treasured metaphysical propositions such as God, which would act as the ontic referent for any objective morality. All of those things are jettisoned when you adopt the scientific outlook, because, again, you take a strictly quantitative approach to things. And when you take a quantitative approach to government, you're really just viewing society as just this mass of reactive animals that have to be conditioned through external stimuli, and the external stimuli, is economic forces and political forces, and so there really is no room in that sort of society, which would be an inherently technocratic one. There's really no room for the essential dignity and the liberty of the individual. But that's what drew me to the topic of deep politics and parapolitics. Of course, I can't speak for Paul and what drew him, but
well, I know that what sustains me in it nowadays is my work as a corrections officer. In the correctional system, what you see is that there is a criminal subculture, and that conspiracy and all manner of law breaking is just commonplace. As a matter of fact, it really doesn't shock anybody that's a participant in that subculture. It's just the way that it's just a day on the job. It's just a day at work, and whether you're trying to do it across the spectrum, whether you're trying to sell narcotics or get narcotics from somebody, or you're just trying to set up some kind of like in the carceral systems, something just like setting up a time and a date and a place where you can get a loan with your significant other, with because in prison that's forbidden under PREA and the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Just getting a loan with them away from any of the correction officers or any of the authorities around to catch you and everything. But it goes. For me, it went back to high school. I ran with a lot of different kids back in Colorado at the high school that we attended, Horizon High School, and there was this large anarchist contingent there, and they were basically kids that believed in everything that makes up anarchy, the extreme side of the libertarian spectrum. And of course, I can't give my assent to anarchy or to anything as far as libertarianism goes, really. But you have to give it to these people because they do have excellent critiques of the state. And they had excellent critiques of what is today known as SCADs. And SCADs are basically state. It's an anacronym. It's an acronym for state crimes against democracy, and a SCAD is not really something that emerged out. This construct of the SCAD didn't emerge out of some kind of conspiracy subgenre of books or out of some kind of subculture of conspiracy theorists. It's a scholarly topic that I believe was started by a professor at the University of Florida. His name escapes me at this moment.
No, he wrote the book Conspiracy Theory in America.
Yeah. Are you sure about that, or is it?
I think that's the book.
Okay,
Conspiracy
all
Theory
right.
in America. Yeah.
Well, I know that. I know that when he was presenting the whole idea of SCAD, that he basically attacked the whole idea of basically the means by which the establishment stigmatizes any kind of elevated criminology that looks at elite deviance as quote unquote conspiracy theory. And but these kids back in high school, these anarchists, they had a lot of great critiques of the state and of statism and basically looked a lot at the excesses of the state and the excesses of the establishment which controls the state.
I think it was Lance DeHaven Smith.
That's the one. Yes, that's him.
I'm sorry. Correct.
It's from the University of Florida. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, Conspiracy Theory in America. It's in my Kindle here. I just saw it.
Gotcha. I've seen his PowerPoint presentations and all. I haven't had an opportunity to read the book. He did come out with an excellent article in a scholarly journal. I can't remember what the name of the scholarly journal is. I'm running extemporaneously right now and everything. But yeah, we didn't have the term SCADs back in 1992, 91, 93 when I was running with these kids. But that's basically, we didn't. I mean, because while we were astute in one respect, in another respect, we didn't know our butts from a hole in the ground and everything. You're still a kid, and you're not spending the time doing the deep research that an older adult would do. You're basically listening to rock music and chasing girls.
Yeah, for everything there is a season, right? So
yeah, exactly, and everything. But what they were basically what they were basically decrying and what they were critical of is what we now know from as SCADs, thanks to some of the more honest people within the halls of academia, which Levin Smith is. He's one of the more honest individuals. So that got me reading. That got me into the body of literature and everything that's out there. And then a few years later, when I was attending community college in Ohio, after we relocated from Colorado to Ohio, I had a teacher who was a judge that basically presided over a local court there in the Ohio region, in the Ohio area. His name was Joseph Palmer, and he was one of my teachers. He taught me criminal justice and constitutional law. Periodically, he would give talks about what he did before he was a judge. And what he did before he was a judge was he was an intelligence operative. He played a minor role in the plumber scandal that almost led to his incarceration. And prior to that, when he was in the Marine Corps, he was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to basically act like a Canadian national who was doing trading along the waterways there in Vietnam, because he was in Vietnam, and it basically collect intelligence from MVA and Viet Cong sources there and all, but masquerading as a Canadian, if I recall correctly. And he ended up spending he made friends with an MVA general. The general invited him to go to Hanoi. He didn't want to go to Hanoi. His handlers told him, go to Hanoi to, gather intelligence. He went, spent 3 days there, was absolutely terrified because he's the only white guy walking around in Hanoi, and really did a bad job of collecting intelligence because he just couldn't psychologically function. And you could imagine it would be. I assume it would be like you and I being in the middle of North Korea right now, or something like that. To draw a possible analogy. So his handlers got pissed at him and basically sold him up the river, burned him, basically leaked it to the MVA that he was with the CIA, or he was an American. And if it wasn't for his general friend saving his life, he would be dead today and all. But he came back and, told his tale and talked about the Central Intelligence Agency. The man has no doubt whatsoever in his mind. It is beyond the moral certainty to him that the Kennedy assassination was not the result of a lone gunman, but was the result of planning and plotting by several different deep state players, the Central Intelligence Agency included. And so he really he got me ignited as far as that's concerned. And he really got me to start taking my research seriously and not just passively reading a book here and there. So I started I just delved deep into the literature at that point. And then it was finally around 2001 when the 9/11 attacks occurred that I decided, well, the deep state obviously has an overarching control agenda. It's obvious that the plans associated with that agenda have been accelerated considerably. So it's time to start publishing and writing stuff about this, because God knows how much longer we'll have to do this and everything. And that's what set Philip and myself off with writing and publishing the book that we wrote, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, and a lot of articles until it started to slow down and taper off around 2010, because we just got so involved in local journalism and just all in our respective coverage areas and making a living, that you just couldn't focus on it the way that we wanted to. And now we're starting to pick back up again, and especially when this book is finally finished, we'll be hopefully diving back deep into the field and getting more of a public eye on us again. Tim, you there? Tim?
I'm sorry, I had my mute button on. There are a few there are a few academicians and even college classes, I think, to delve into some of these things now. I haven't been in a college classroom in a couple of decades, more than a couple of decades, so I can't speak to it myself. But generally speaking, when you're studying political science or history, this type of analysis into deep politics gets overlooked, particularly by mainstream, historians, media, and academicians. So to really understand what's going on, you have to kind of understand the meaning of groups like, whether it's Freemasonry or secret societies, the importance that they've played throughout history. In your work, you take on things like Rosicrucianism and their role in Freemasonry's role in developing things like the Royal Society,
right,
developing our understanding of science and therefore of reality, and the idea of occulted knowledge, but also the idea of how these ideas can be used as a practical method to undermine governments, to spread revolution. The British Empire, of course, relied on Freemasonic organizational principles to expand and control the world.
Right. Well, basically, a lot of those secret societies that you named, and several more, basically provided the philosophical and theological foundation, the backbone, the spine of this concept that we hear about frequently, the New World Order. They provided the philosophical and theological or spiritual backbone of that, but they also, at times, periodically acted actually as elite conduits or deep political combines, in the respect that there was intense secrecy within Freemasonry and intense secrecy within those lodges, and so that secrecy allowed for certain members to begin to systematize the means and methods of what we know to be deep politics, which is the practices of law breaking, of secrecy, of theft, of graft, of bribery, of blackmail, and of conspiracy that is considered, commonplace in the deep political world. And so, you start there, and then you build upon that with the political manifestations of all those philosophies and spiritual ideas with semi-secret political groups like the round tables that were started by Alfred Milner and Cecil Rhodes, with John Ruskin acting as the inspiration, and then moving on from there to the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which had the round tables as their nexus. Moving on from there to stateside sister branches here in the United States that were meant to pass the mantle on from the British elite to the American elite. Those stateside sister groups would be like the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, and on it goes. Yeah, and you build upon it with layers and layers and layers, and until you have you actually have a complete academic discipline there. If anybody were to ever have the brass to actually start a class, within the halls of academia, and Levin Smith, he's one example of an honest academic that has looked at this honestly. Another individual would be who was within the halls of academia that has looked at this honestly and presented a very fair presentation of it, would be Peter Dale Scott. Mm-hmm. His works are essential, whether you're talking about cocaine politics or his more recent books over 9/11 and continuity of government. I think it was actually, the book was called The American Deep State, if I recall correctly. And
there's also The Road to 9/11 too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, The Road to 9/11. These books actually treat the topic as a matter of scholarship, and thank God that we have people like that, because there's also a lot of hucksters out there that capitalize on the topic to make money, and as a result, either present factual information in a sensational way, or mix factual information with a lot of sensational, baseless hearsay. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot, unfortunately, a lot of that out there. And there's also, to boot, the white noise specialists, the disinformation agents that are out there that'll take a grain of truth and then stick it in with a lot of just crap. The Jesuits did it. It's all a Jewish world conspiracy, mm-hmm. that kind of stuff, and muddy the waters thus, and make it hard for people to follow the real investigational threads and the real meat.
Now, you mentioned the round table, the Rhodes Circle, or the Milner's group, and his idea of it brings to mind. There's a researcher, Kevin Cole, who's mm-hmm. in the work. I interviewed him last year about this topic itself, about Carroll Quigley and what he revealed in his book Tragedy and Hope. And of course, you're familiar with my interviews with Jay Dyer and his work in that field too. Jay
is doing some very great service to the field with his analysis of that book, because I don't know many person that is able to do what he did and actually sit down
read the book.
1,300 page book of dry history, drier than a box of saltine crackers, and actually lay it out in a way that's not only understandable but interesting mm-hmm. to the listening audience.
Yeah, someone asked me recently if I ever read the Treasure Hope in its entirety. I said no, only really about a couple hundred pages, and that's why I'm paying Jay Dyer $4.95 a month to read it for me. So, So.
Good policy to have.
But Kevin Cole had his idea talking about this whole idea, when you mentioned academic disciplines, he said the whole discipline of international relations as it is understood today is all part of that Rhodes notion of this enclosed system of understanding reality or how the world should work. And the study of international relations, how nations relate to one another, is all part of that plan and the norm. How the world works. This is the norm. So anything that breaks out of that norm is considered, renegade or criminal.
Yeah.
Gangster-like. Yeah.
I mean, they laid down the parameters of that discipline of international relations and international politics, and you don't step beyond that. You don't step beyond the parameters that they laid down for that discipline. And I don't want to get too far afield from the topic that we're going to talk about, but just to give you an example, anybody who actually presents Russia in a positive light on the international stage is instantly ridiculed by establishment scholars. And if you go back to Carol Quigley's book, you find a profuse just Russophobia and all, and a hatred for anything related to Byzantium, related to Eastern theology, related to the Orthodox Church, to the Orthodox culture that made up the pre-Soviet Russian nation, and that's where that Russophobia got started. It didn't start with Hillary Clinton, but she certainly contracted the disease.
Yes.
And everything. So anybody that presents Russia as a positive force on the world stage and as a positive world actor in the realms of international politics and all has stepped beyond the parameters that were set for the discipline of international politics and international relations by the whole Rhodes, Milner, Roundtable, Royal Institute of International Affairs axis.
Yeah, he creates this dichotomy of the good, just, virtuous, liberal West versus the backward East, Russia.
Yeah.
And that's another area where Jay Dyer did a good job of pointing that out, because Jay Dyer is well versed in Eastern Orthodoxy and in his study of that of Tragedy and Hope, he points out how Quigley gives this almost cartoon, almost Cold War propagandistic interpretation of Russia, even before Russia was even communist. So there's a long stand,
Right, absolutely. Going back to the great game between Britain and Russia, which was prior to which was prior to the attempts to set up a Soviet Rus.
And we now know, because through the study works of people like Anthony Sutton, that even what Quigley reveals in the book is that the Soviet era was largely a result of an ideology and also a political party, the Bolsheviks, that were imported from the West into Russia as sort of as a bacillus to weaken Russia.
That's right. It was a Western export. It was an imposition on that nation by Western powers. Anybody that's read anything about the 1918 Red Cross mission to Petrograd knows that, because you have people like William Boyd Thompson of the Federal Reserve, New York Federal Reserve, going over there. You have all these Western financiers going over as part of this Red Cross mission, and then you have all the Red Cross employees coming back totally disillusioned, while these financiers stayed and did their business.
Yep.
And everything, and basically, financed the takeover of that nation. And everything. That kind of goes a far field of what we talk, but it's relevant to what
Actually, this is somewhat relevant to the article about dominionism. You open the article. The article is Dominionism, or Their Kingdom Come: Dominionism's Quest for a Political Capital in the Emergent New World Order, And you open up the article in a reference to John 18:36, where Jesus explains to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." And I'll let you take it from there.
Certainly. What Jesus was basically saying to Pilate was that the kingdom of God would not arise out of the temporal administrative machinery of human states. That's not to say that the state is inherently evil, because that view is an inherently Gnostic one. That's symptomatic of the Gnostic proclivity to project evil outside of the intangible will and onto the intangible world, and basically depict any form of civil society as somehow a satanic conspiracy to control people. That's not what you derive from that particular piece of scripture. The point is that the eschaton, or the end of days, is not brought into not drawn into human history by the work of man, and that Jesus's kingdom would come. The parousia would begin on God's timetable according to God's will. But dominionism takes quite a different view. Dominionism and dominion theology are pejoratives coined by sociologist Sarah Diamond in 1989 to apply to Christians seeking political and cultural hegemony. The dominionist believes that subjugating the institutions of government, media, and entertainment, business, and education, all of this is mandated on the dominionist view by sacred scripture. And this contention is premised upon a politicized interpretation of Genesis chapter 1:28, wherein it reads, and I'll read it verbatim for the edification of the audience, quote, "And God blessed them," Adam and Eve, "and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth," unquote. Now, dominionists reinterpret biblical dominion, which is responsible stewardship of the created order, acting as the priest of the inherently good creation that God created, because he did create it good. They reinterpret that biblical dominion as political dominion. It is the dominionist's eschatological hope that a successful political coup will induce the parousia, the second coming. It is human action within history that will compel Jesus to return. And on the dominionist view, Christ is either unwilling to or incapable of returning to earth until Christians establish the kingdom of God through the seizure of social and governmental institutions. Thus, the eschaton, the end of days, indwells history, and political activism becomes soteriological in character. It becomes salvific. Now, this transposition of the eschaton within history, within the flux of history, was presaged by, ironically enough, certain neo-Gnostic theoreticians whose systems would spawn virulently anti-theistic political movements. This tide of new Gnosticism finds its proximate origins with late 12th century Calabrian abbot and hermit Joachim of Fiore. Joachim apocalypticized history by configuring it according to a Trinitarian eschatology. Within the framework of Joachim's eschatology, each hypostasis in the Trinity, each person in that Trinity represented a specific historical phase. The pre-Christian era was divided into the age of the Father, who represented the Old Testament, and the Son, who represented the New Testament. The third apocalyptic age, of which Joachim was the self-proclaimed prophet, was the age of the Holy Spirit. And during this age, sacred scripture, the church, and the state would all be done away with. They would all be obliterated and give way to a free communist world. And echoing ancient Gnosticism's docetistic attitude toward physical embodiment, Joachim claimed that man within this age would divest himself of all flesh and enter into disembodied bliss. So you have there the reiteration of the Gnostic theme of reabsorption into the pleroma, the divesting of one's corporeal shell and becoming part of this disembodied singularity within which deific power, the power of divinity, operated at optimal. So it's kind of a soft autotheism. But at any rate, after Joachim came the 17th century German cobbler Jakob Boehm, who inspired the mystical English communist Gerard Winstanley. Now, like the heresiarch Marcion, Boehm advanced a bifurcated conception of God to reflect what was perceived as two contrary natures. In Boehm's view, the God of the Old Testament embodied wrath, while the God of the New Testament embodied love. And these two contrary natures were, in Boehm's view, mirrors of human consciousness, and history was really the evolutionary dialectical process whereby these binary essences were reconciled. While Boehm's ideas closely parallel Gnostic emanationist speculation, there is a certain point of departure. Ancient Gnosticism expressed, of course, a docetistic cosmological attitude that viewed divinity's descent into materiality as a horrific error. In contradistinction to this view, Boehm presented the descent of divinity into materiality as an essential phase in God's self-revelation. And by asserting that both light and darkness could be derived from the ground of being, Boehm departed radically from ancient Gnosticism. Instead of elevating the transcendent to the detriment of the immanent, which the ancient Gnostics did, Boehm's new Gnosticism elevated the immanent to the detriment of the transcendent. But this modern Gnosticism softened the radical dualism and cosmological pessimism of its ancient progenitor, thereby adopting an idealistic optic that supplanted the ancient heresies' explicitly nihilistic view with a more utopian outlook. This idealistic Gnosticism became the optic through which the modern revolutionary viewed the world. From the revolutionary standpoint, utopia is actuated through the dialectical process of history. And that stands in stark contrast to the ancient Gnostic view, which really held contempt for the very notion of history. Now, according to this new Gnosticism, history is a redemptive process. The revolutionary participates in the collision of binary oppositions that catalyzes the dialectic of history. And presumably, this process will redeem the world. And ironically, this immanentizing form of Gnosticism is equally docetistic, as is evidenced by its pathological obsession with change. This obsession really just bespeaks an implicit dissatisfaction with matter in its present state. This tacit derision invariably motivates destructive campaigns that will supposedly expunge all of the social ills allegedly preventing utopia's eventuation. It was mystical traditions such as those spawned by Boehm that gave rise to a Gnostically inspired version of the story of salvation. This soteriological narrative, which exalted man as a Christ in the Promethean role of Lucifer, found a place in George Friedrich Hegel's dialectical metaphor of divine self-abasement. The basis for the harmonization of Gnostic dualism with Hegel's dialectical idealism is ultimately theodicy. Like Boehm, Hegel viewed the Godhead's alleged atomization and the resultant emergence of being as an essential juncture in the Absolute's migration back toward self-revelation. But in keeping with his Romanticist heritage, Hegel believed that man was God, albeit an earthbound divinity afflicted by some inexplicable spiritual amnesia. For whatever reason, man was God in the beginning, but somehow forgot. And basically, Hegel radically revised the Gnosio-Hermetic scheme. As James Kelly points out in his book, Anatomizing Divinity, he observes the Gnostic projected his eudaimonistic passions into the divine sphere, and in so doing, the Gnostic rendered man as a theocosmological process whereby God supposedly arrived at self-knowledge. And this Gnosio-Hermetic scheme was composed of anthropos, which of course is man, cosmos, or the world, and theos, which is God. Hegel and his fellow romantics would remove the emanationist tiers of the Gnosio-Hermetic scheme, leaving anthropos as the sole manifestation of the divine essence. And in so doing, they advanced a more explicitly autotheistic form of Gnosticism. No longer was man a lower emanation of God. Instead, humanity in toto was God. According to Hegel, the dialectic of history was the process that allowed man to reacquaint himself with his forgotten divinity. Now, of course, Marx redefined Hegel's ideological shadows as material bodies, and in so doing, he formulated dialectical materialism. No longer was the dialectic of history couched in any form of mysticism. Instead, it was confined to the realm of matter. Marx's dialectical materialism partitioned humanity off into the dichotomous categories of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Of course, such a binary opposition made no allowances for understanding or compromise between these two categories. Instead, you had a intractable political and social polarity, and that was engendered by those who imbibed the Manichaean vision of Marxism. Supposedly, the ensuing conflict that arose from this dialectic would eventually give rise to utopia. In light of the apocalyptic tone of this narrative, it comes as really little surprise that Marx vaguely echoed English Civil War millennial sects and post-millennial Dutch and German Anabaptist. Throughout this Marxian process, man would procure insights concerning his actual nature and reconfigure the world in accordance with that nature. And in so doing, man would discover that the transcendent God was merely a projection of humanity's finest features into a hypostatic beyond. This is all indicative of Marx's influence by Feuerbach, who, of course, Feuerbach's anthropomorphic projectionism held that God was just the projection of man's finest features into this hypostatic beyond, and in actuality, man was God, and God was really the separate transcendent God was really just a product of vicarious autotheism, and man actually was God. He just somehow forgot it and projected his identity outside of himself. Now, history's watershed moment would come when man would reclaim that projection and consequentially be transfigured into divine. The eschatological hope of Marxism was ultimately apotheosis. So you still have a theos there. And that's an inescapable conclusion of atheism. Atheism thrives on the affirmation of a negative. Atheism basically claims dogmatically with absolute epistemic certitude that there is no God. However, in order to claim with epistemic certitude that there is no God, you have to lay claim to a trait of divinity, and that is omniscience. But if you lay claim to omniscience, then you are thereby asserting that you are God. And this was the natural ends of Marx's dialectical materialism and of his atheism. But common among these systems is a historical progression consisting of a series of phases in God's self-revelation and salvific plan. History becomes a redemptive process, and these systems would spawn several crusades that would be characterized
as soteriological social movements. And this characterization is premised upon these movements' fanatical belief in a redemptive process throughout history. Within history, history again becomes a redemptive process. And this is where the new Gnosticism departs from the old Gnosticism. The old Gnosticism, again, held in derision any notions of history. And the descent into materiality was viewed as a horrible mistake. It was a terrible error. It was a cosmic abortion. But through the theological revisions of Hegel and Hegel's progenitors, mainly Jakob Boehm and Joachim of Fior, the descent into materiality is suddenly viewed as a necessary phase of God's self-revelation. And by the time you arrive at Marx, that self-revelation of God is man rediscovering his forgotten divinity, which somehow arose out of some inexplicable spiritual amnesia. But you take Marxism, it held that this redemptive process within history would be facilitated through the conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat would redeem the world from thousands of years of class exploitation. Likewise, you take Hitler's Aryanism, and it promised to redeem the world from the alleged corruption of mankind by so-called inferior races. Cultural feminism, which has rose to prominence in recent years, seeks to redeem the world from millennia of alleged male domination. All of these are basically reiterations of a redemptive view of history, of this redemptive history arising from this new Gnosticism. Now, sadly, some Christian theological movements imbibed these systems during the 19th century. The result was dispensationalism, which, like these previous systems, segments history into separate prophetic eras preceding the eschaton. These prophetic ages are called dispensations, and this is from whence comes the elaborate flowcharts accompanied by apocalyptic imagery inspired by the books of Daniel and Revelation. You see it all the time. If you turn on TBN and you happen to catch Pastor John Hagee, John Hagee's up there with these elaborate flowcharts and all these these funny pictures that are depictions of the apocalyptic events in the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. And by the way, I apologize, my John Hagee impersonation's not nearly as good as Jay Dyer's. But that's from
the blood moon was that?
Yeah,
the blood moons.
Yeah, the blood moons, and you see
how Lindsay really got the ball rolling even before John Hagee with this sort of
this segmented history, this segmented history that is supposedly redemptive in nature. But when we reflect on the theoreticians that we have just surveyed, we see that dispensationalism exhibits the same modern Gnostic tendency to situate the eschaton within history. We also identify the same Gnostic preoccupation with calendrics, as is evidenced by some dispensationalists' failed attempts to predict the end of the world. And again, you have John Hagee, the blood moon. It's the blood moon, and the end is nigh.
And he's obsessed with the calendar. And as much as Latinized theology has experienced a degeneration, and Latinized Christianity has seen something of a serious deterioration, just part of the larger degeneration and deterioration of Western civilization. It should be noted that Saint Augustine, who is probably considered the greatest of all the Latins, of all the Latin theologians, he said it himself. He said, "Don't be obsessed with the ideas of calendars and of date setting as it pertains to eschatology."
Yeah, well, and arguably,
if you look at the Greek patristic tradition, you look at the early church fathers, arguably they were probably amillennial. They really didn't engage in eschatological speculations. But additionally, there are some soteriological ramifications that arise from dispensationalism. Each dispensation supposedly witnessed certain changes in the relational dynamic between God and man. So salvation in one era would be defined differently in another. And so within this confused soteriology, one could assert that the practices of Orthodox Christianity and Judaism are equally salvific in spite of their significant disparities. This observation shouldn't really, don't construe what I'm about to say as anti-Semitic invective. I'm not saying that all Jews are going to hell. Obviously, there's no way for us to know that. Orthodox Christianity lays no claim to epistemological certainty concerning one's soteriological status. However, both sets of practices, Judaism and Orthodox Christianity, exhibit certain mutually exclusive features that cannot be expected to produce the same results. The Orthodox Christian has been given the way, and it radically departs from Judaism, which is actually the synagogue Phariseeism that survived the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Dispensationalism's failure to acknowledge this historical fact has compelled many of its adherents to indiscriminately advocate all of Israel's national policies, their ethical shortcomings notwithstanding.
Yes,
And
John
that-
Hagee's, I think, practical value to Israel.
Right, exactly.
Right. As a
And
matter of fact,
he's paid well for it, from what I understand. So.
oh, absolutely he is. Anecdotally speaking, I have a friend who is just immersed in this stuff, and that's his faith tradition, and you can point out the employment of white phosphorus by Israeli defense forces against Palestinians, many of whom are Christians, by the way, and everything. And there's just a shutdown. It doesn't matter. They're God's people.
Yeah,
they're the chosen people.
The moral repugnance of these acts are completely overlooked because, from the view of some dispensationalists, the 1948 formation of the modern secular state of Israel is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
And he is still waiting for a Russian invasion of Israel like that which Hal Lindsey foretold in his book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which is a late great book because it's been late on everything. But he's still anticipating that. And I've pointed out to him, I've said, well, Russia has in a lot of respects become an Orthodox confessional state. And so it's a Christian state, but you're telling me that that God would, if this Christian nation were to move against Israel because of some of the things it's doing, some of the underhanded covert politics that it's playing in places like Syria, if it were to move against them because of that, God would still strike them down on behalf of secular Israel. And his answer is, well, yeah, because they're God's chosen people.
Well, and
the morality of it, the morality of all the political manifestations of Israeli policy notwithstanding.
Yeah, and again, this all is a direct result of dispensationalism's confused soteriology. It arises out of this belief that there are dispensations and that man's relational dynamic with God changes from one dispensation to the next, and so one salvation in one dispensation means something different in another. And
this distortion of Christian theology, I think, I did a recent interview with James Perloff regarding Christian Zionism and the importance of the Schofield Bible, which seemed to be funded by Samuel Untermeyer and the early Zionists, and it could have been a black op directed to coalesce Christian support for the formation of the State of Israel, because at the time the Pope had rejected Zionism. I think,
right.
And so they needed to organize the evangelical community because they couldn't get the Catholic Church's support for it. So they produced the Schofield Bible, which produced this flawed theology to justify the eventual formation of Israel, which occurred, it needed the events of the Second World War for the plan to come into fruition. But in the article, you mentioned John Hagee actually rejects the notion of Christ as the Messiah and embraces the idea of a political Messiah, which means that to me, that's an example of Hagee being Judaicized. He's looking for a political Messiah.
Yeah. He's basically engaging in the heresy of Judaizing, which of course Saint Paul took Saint Peter to task for. But he arrives at the conclusion that Jesus's mission was not to act as the Messiah for the redemption of humanity and the redemption of the cosmos, but instead he was a political Messiah. He was basically an insurrectionist. He was a zealot, and that all results from this. Dispensationalist segmenting off history into these particular dispensations wherein man's relational dynamic with God changes. And if man's relational dynamic with God changes, if the way that the ancient Jew related to God is different from the way that the modern Christian related with God, then one could compellingly argue that salvation for one was different from salvation for the other. So conceivably, a Jew needn't accept Christ as God in order to be saved, or in order to begin their salvific journey. Again, gosh, I have to reiterate this disclaimer ad nauseum. I am not saying every Jew is a hellbound sinner. That is not what I'm saying.
I think the best way to put it is that we're not talking in terms of race. We're talking in terms of theological constructs right now.
Right. But what I am, again, Orthodox Christianity does not lay claim to epistemological certainty concerning the soteriological statuses of individuals. We cannot say who is going to hell, who isn't. But the problem is that the way by which one hopefully attains the hope of salvation, because you're not saved in a single moment. You're not saved just by saying the sinner's prayer and you're done, you're over with. I mean, I'm sorry, but man's sins are far too deep for salvation to be procured through the recitation of a single prayer. You are being saved. You've been saved. You're being saved, and you will be saved, provided you cooperate with grace. Through the process that is the way. But the problem is that the way on the dispensationalist view changes, and so suddenly an ancient Jew is granted this self-righteous Gnostic exceptionalism. They needn't do what the modern Christian does. They will have salvation no matter what they do.
Which will lead to all types of problems.
Creates all types of problems. Yeah. And by the way, I'm not saying that Israel should be wiped off the map either. I believe that the state of Israel has the right to exist, but if it engages in the same political malfeasance and the same human rights atrocities that you see other nation states engaging in, it must be criticized for that. It must be called to the mat. Any atrocities have to be condemned.
I'd like to interject at this point, because I did some work and had some correspondence with two Jewish researchers, Joel Boehnerman, who wrote an excellent book called Crimes of the President, and Barry Hamish. And I think that what they've pointed out about the Jewish elite is very, very important. The political elite over Israel, and the political elite in Israel, the Jewish elite that are over the people there, are very much like the hierarchy of the American Catholic Church. Where not the Church in Rome, but American Catholics. here we have this situation where the hierarchy here in America of the Catholic Church has subordinated their Catholicism to Americanism, and they identify more with the American ideal and ideas than they do with the teachings of the Catholic Church. David Wimhoff and Michael Jones have gone into this in some detail, so yes. I'm not going to try to steal that.
This was a project of Henry Luce, Time Life, and John Courtney Murray.
Yeah, and the CIA.
And the CIA.
All of those deep state players there were pivotal in changing the way that the American Catholic viewed church-state relations, and as a result, they see themselves more as Americans than they see themselves as Catholics. The same principle kind of holds in Israel, where the Israeli elite, the prime minister, the Knesset, the Jewish elite over there identify more with the Atlanticist than they do with any kind of Jewish heritage. They see themselves more as kind of a regional proxy of the Atlanticist.
Well, that's interesting because the history behind that suggests that the creation of the modern state of Israel was an Atlanticist scheme.
Yeah. But I mean, and again,
backed by powerful Jews, like the Rothschilds, of course, but also Chaim Weizmann, and here in people like Jacob Schiff and the Wahlbergs, things like that.
Barry Hamish in particular, when he and I were talking, he pointed out that that Zionism was really a mixed bag, and if you look at labor Zionism, it goes back into Jewish heretical sects such as the Sabbateans and Jakob Frank and the Frankist movement, and that they're really the subversive forces within Israel, and they've actually betrayed the Israeli population as much as the Atlanticists have betrayed the American American population. So I think that kind of applies to the conversation here, where these Jewish elites will carry out an Atlanticist agenda, and the evangelical community here in the United States ends up backing their play, no matter how immoral it might be, and no matter how much it's connected to the elitist ambitions of the Atlanticists, which many evangelicals find to be actually oppose, and they still back the Jewish elites and what they're doing because of this idea that they're somehow the chosen people and beyond reproach and all of that.
Yeah, and if I may add one more little footnote to all this, you don't have to be a Gentile to be anti-Semitic, as is evidenced by Karl Marx, who I mentioned before. Karl Marx, of course, reiterated this redemptive view of history, which was passed down from Joachim Fior to Jakob Boehm to George Friedrich Hegel. Karl Marx himself was virulently anti-Semitic. He hated the Jewish people, and in this case, Karl Marx would qualify as Hofjuden. So when we're discussing the problems with dispensationalism and this indiscriminate support of the secular state of Israel, we're not discussing ethnicities. We're not condemning entire ethnic peoples. We're dealing with theological constructs. We're dealing with the soteriological confusion that arises from dispensationalism that gives rise to this moral confusion concerning the policies of the secular state of Israel.
And it also leads to an unfounded guilt among the evangelical community. I mean, again, with for instance, anecdotally, again, with my friend who is just totally immersed in this millennialist nonsense and all, you can point out to him, look, American firms cannot sell arms to the Chinese, but they can certainly go through Israel and Israeli firms and sell those same arms to the Chinese and totally evade American laws, ITAR laws, any kind of laws that deal with trading with nations that are considered to be rogue or pariah nations and everything. And he can't bring all this something that he would otherwise, if it was being done through any other nation, if it was being done through Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, what have you, he would instantly decry that as immoral. He would say, well, that's traitorous. You're doing arms deals with these pariah nations through a outlaw proxy and all. But when it's Israel that these firms are using to sell these arms to China and all, he can't bring himself. There's a shutdown. He can't bring himself to decry it as morally wrong now because of some kind of guilt he feels if he critiques the nation of Israel or the Israeli elite or the Jewish elite in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, all of this arising from dispensationalist theology, and dispensationalist theology arguably being derivative of these systems of thought that can be traced all the way back to Joachim of Fior, which basically situates the eschaton within history, this new Gnosticism. But these theological problems aside, much of the premillennial dispensationalism that exemplified 20th century evangelicism was actually apolitical. They weren't politically active. However, this rather innocuous variety of Western Christianity would eventually be challenged by a heavily politicized post-millennialism. A major shift occurred in this theological struggle in 1973 when Reverend R.J. Rushdoony published Institute of Biblical Law. And contained therein was the Dominion Mandate, which represented a gross misrepresentation of Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, which I pointed out earlier in our discussion. In contradistinction to the Orthodox Christian view, that man is the priest of creation. That man is he has stewardship over creation, which was created good, inherently good by God. Dominionism holds a more docetistic contempt for the world. On the dominionist view, man is meant to be the conqueror of the cosmos, not its caretaker. And this docetistic attitude extends to the social cosmos as well as the created cosmos. Dominionism reduces Jesus' kingdom to a secular government established by and maintained through secular power. Now, secular progressives cite dominionism as a violation of the separation of church and state, but in actuality, it represents the subsumption of the church under the state. Dominionism actually enthrones the temporal machinery of the state. After all, maintenance of the dominionist government would stipulate the inordinate empowerment of political, social, and military forces. Now, while the anticipation of Christ's return is the ostensible motive for the dominionist coup, its theocratic version of the long march through the institutions actually apotheosizes the state. As a result, you have the same sort of situation that you had with Marxian statism. As was the case with Marxian statism, the dominionist state can never truly wither away. since the establishment of such a state never was and never will be the prerequisite for the parousia. It will not incite the second coming. This theocratic totalitarianism is enshrined indefinitely. Thus, the state, not Christ, is Lord. Dominionism is really just statism lurking behind a theological veneer. Dominionism's militant post-millennial eschatology also portends certain Promethean Neo-Pelagian revisions to Orthodox Christian soteriology. According to dominion theology, again, Jesus is either unwilling to or unable to return to earth. Now, if this is true, if this contention holds sway, then Christ's role as Savior is nullified. After all, the scriptures state that Christ's return will represent the final installment in humanity's salvation. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28 declares, and I'll quote it verbatim for the edification of the audience, quote, "So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation," unquote. So the parousia is the supremely salvific event. Yet, dominionism tacitly asserts that man, not God, shall make Christ's kingdom come. Thus, the final installation of humanity's salvation is left in the hands of man himself. And herein is an implicit affirmation of the Pelagian belief that man could attain moral perfection through his mortal will. This is really, really ironic. This is truly ironic. And I'm not even going to try to make sense of the internal contradictions here in this theology. But it's truly ironic, since many of dominionism's leading proponents have been Calvinist. And Calvinists would vehemently reject Pelagius's anthropological optimism and radical conception of free will. Nevertheless, dominionism's militant post-millennial eschatology is accompanied by an implicit Promethean neo-Pelagianism. Inducing the parousia would be the ultimate act of will. The dominionist hopes to essentially force God's hand through political activism. And in this sense, dominionism represents a theological iteration of Nietzsche's will to power. But that kind of, in a nutshell, is what dominion theology is, what dominionism is. Now, I'm sorry. Go right ahead, Tim.
To what you mentioned, there was 1973, Rushdoony's book on dominionism. That's a pivotal year, 1973, because you're kind of alluding to or mentioning the sort of the rise of I guess the political consciousness of the evangelical movement in the United States. This is the 1970s. This is the middle of the tail end of the sexual revolution, the rise of feminism. The cultural war is raging at this point. It's been raging ever since. And so it's largely, at least my understanding was, the rise of the evangelical movement, the moral majority, as a political movement, was a reaction to the excesses of the 1960s and early 1970s. And so they were able to mobilize millions of people. Many Democrats became Republicans because of this in the late 70s and early 80s. This was Reagan's majority. How much of this was a reaction to, Ashen was, as Nixon called, acid, abortion, and amnesty. With the courts, judicial activism, advocating abortion, first contracept, with the Griswold decision in 67, 66, and you have the 73 decision Roe v. Wade, and from that point on, you had this division in the country.
You're absolutely right, and you're right in pointing out the time period, 73 and everything. 73. Well, 1 year prior.
What I'm saying is, from the Christian's perspective, the institutions of government became hostile to the to traditional values. They considered
they did, like you said, and it caused this counterattack. It caused this response, this response from the conservative conservative portion of American society,
and not just evangelicals. Look at Catholics. Catholics
Yeah.
were overwhelmingly Democrat, right? Until the 1970s.
If I recall, 72 was the election year.
Mm-hmm.
It was okay. 72 was an election year when Nixon ran against Wallace. Look at what happened that year. Wallace carried only one state.
Not Wallace.
Sorry,
McGovern.
not Wallace. McGovern. Sorry,
Wallace was taken out.
Yeah. Sorry. No.
Another lone nut, right?
Yeah. But McGovern was running. McGovern was running against Nixon, and McGovern took only one state. He took, I believe, it was Massachusetts.
Not his home state.
Yeah. The rest of the map, the rest of America went to Nixon. And I believe that basically was one of the manifestations of this counterattack made by the conservative people in the religious right who Nixon was tapping into, and all. It was a manifestation of them saying enough is enough, because McGovern didn't have an ice cube's chance in hell. But the problem is that whenever these kinds of things happen, the oligarchs here in the United States, they see a group rising, they see the reaction coming, and all. They see the counter revolution, and so what they do is they move to co-opt it. Mm-hmm. And everything, and we can get into co-option of conservative groups by looking at taking a closer look at the Council for National Policy.
Yeah, something I want to get into. That's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. That group plays a major role in the article, and it's one of the groups that we've looked at the most in terms of dominionism and as far as the whole subversion of the conservative movement and the religious right here in the United States.
So here we have Christian at this point in the 70s, early 80s. Christians become obsessed with politics as opposed to
right.
matters of faith, or
Well, no. Can I touch on something with that, Tim?
Sure.
I apologize. I don't want to be too tangential, but it's important to note that dominionism only affects a narrow cross-section of politically active conservative Christians. Now, as of late, the term dominionist has been applied with an unhealthy degree of elasticity, which has been resulting in this sort of religious McCarthyism. More and more politically active Christians are being indiscriminately assigned the stigma of dominionist. But when we speak of dominionist, we are not talking about the average Christian whose political decisions are informed by his or her faith. Mm-hmm. We are talking about a revolutionary, not unlike the Jacobin of the French Revolution. And sadly, the failure to distinguish one from the other has led some detractors, many of whom are Christians, particularly those of the fringe fundamentalist ilk, to cite Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 to 9 as the basis for this non sequitur that all national governments belong to the devil and therefore all political processes are inherently satanic. Thus, we have the premises for this quasi-Christian form of anarchism. Now, first of all, there is no etymological basis for this contention. The term kingdom, as it appears in Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 to 9, is translated from the Greek word basileia, which denotes a territory subject to the rule of a king. The term government, as it appears in the New Testament, is translated from the Greek word kubernesis, which connotes any number of political systems. So there's no absolute etymological continuity between the term basileia and kubernesis. Context is everything. The quasi-Christian anarchist interpretation of Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 to 9 only remains logically coherent if the passage is ripped from the matrix of a broader biblical gestalt and read in isolation. And ironically, such an interpretation is inherently Gnostic. Anarchist themes pervade the meta-parables delivered by the Gnostic Christ of the Gospel of Thomas. And in those meta-parables, the Gnostic Christ presents clothing as a metaphor for civic government, for civic authority, and for gender. And nudity is invoked as this analog for the abolition of all ordered forms of government. For instance, stanza 21 of the Gospel of Thomas reads, and I'll read it verbatim for the edification of the audience, quote, Mary said to Jesus, "What are your disciples like?" He said, "They are like children living in a field that is not theirs. When the owners of the field come, they will say, 'Give us back our field.' They take off their clothes in front of them in order to give it back to them, and they return their field to them." Unquote. Now, implicit in this excerpt is the rejection of private property and any sort of civil authority to protect it. And this derision for government overlooks the very fact that God established the pillars of a proper civil authority in the Old Testament. Moreover, it reiterates Jean-Jacques Rousseau's hypothetical state of nature, which inspired Enlightenment revolutionaries like Robespierre, Saint-Just, and, of course, the infamous Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Bavarian Illuminati. Not surprisingly, the Manitist crusade of communism recruited many anarchists to its ranks. And it is indeed ironic that so many Christians interpret Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 to 9 in a manner that more closely reflects the ideas of virulently anti-theistic and Gnostic thinkers. And you have this in this rejection of national governments and the rejection of politics altogether, this view of it as being somehow inherently evil in all sorts of other Gnostic texts, such as the dialogue with the Savior, of course, as I mentioned before, the Gospel of Thomas, the Book of Thomas the Contender, the Tripartite Tractate, the Treatise of Resurrection. In all of those Gnostic texts, you have these advocacies for anarchism, and this stems from the Gnostic conflation of evil with ontology instead of with moral orientation. Again, the Gnostic projects evil outside of the intangible human will and onto the tangible human world. And so then the administrative machinery, which is really impersonal, the administrative machinery of the state is impersonal. Its trajectory is determined by the moral agents who guide it. It in and of itself cannot be considered either evil or good. It's just there. Okay, it's morally neutral. All of a sudden, from this view, it becomes intrinsically evil. And the problem is that this relies on the rejection of sin, the projection of evil outside of the human will and onto the tangible world, which, as St. Basil the Great noted, results in this rebound of blame to the Creator, because after all, you're projecting evil onto the created order. Therefore, the Creator must be evil himself, because he, after all, he did create it. And so you have this retreat into Masotheism. And that's not the problem with dominionism. The problem is not politically active Christians. The problem is not Christians whose political decisions are informed by their faiths. The problem is the problem that is symptomatic of dominionism is this belief that political activism is soteriological in character, that it's going to somehow instigate the parousia, this belief that the eschaton indwells history and that the hand of man will force the hand of God. That is the problem. That is the main problem with dominion theology. It is not the problem of civic authority, of governments, of the state. The state is a morally neutral force. The problem is the moral agents that guide it.
I'd like to add a little something here. Going back to what you were saying. Okay, Rushdoony published his book in 1973. 1972, you had the landslide victory of Nixon over McGovern. And McGovern only carried Massachusetts, and the rest of the map fell to Nixon. And Nixon, by the way, was
of the Southern Rim cowboy faction of the elite, which I can get into a little as this conversation goes on.
Yeah,
and everything. The oligarchs here in the United States saw how he had tapped into the indignation and the anger and the rage of the religious right and of conservatives here in the United States, who correctly saw themselves as victims of Atlanticist occupation. And so the oligarchs saw that how Nixon had successfully tapped into that and had won a landslide victory as a result. And so they began through things like dominionism to move to co-opt the conservatives and the evangelicals.
And this brings us to the Council for National Policy.
Yes, it does.
But in the article, but prior to that, I think you bring up the development of neoconservatism and its rise and its influence in the Bush administration.
Absolutely. And the neocons would basically use the dominionist and would use organizations like the Council for National Policy to mobilize the evangelicals behind the president's neoconservative initiatives, because that's basically what the Bush II administration was basically a vehicle for the neoconservative rogue faction of the establishment.
PNAC and that crowd, yeah.
The guys that had basically gone off in a rogue trajectory, had kind of gone off the reservation, and were now attempting to force American hegemony in a way that that basically turns off the liberal Eastern establishment, because it's so crass, to use the terms of one journalist. It's so crass, it's so overt, it's so in your face. The excesses are out in the open. It instantly leads to the rise of political counter alliances, and thus causes a threat to the very hegemony that it sought to preserve.
You have a quote from James Kurth about neoconservatism in the article. You say, from their origins, be it as follows of Leon Trotsky or of Leo Strauss, neoconservatives have seen Christian tradition as an alien, even threatening one. As for the classical tradition, their view of it has been formed by the decidedly untraditional interpretation of classical philosophy given by Strauss. The only Western tradition that the neoconservatives actually want to defend is the Enlightenment.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, I like
absolutely. They were Trotskyist in drag. And, yes. and Trotsky was a communist, and communism finds its philosophical spine, its backbone, in the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And everything. And this is something that's hard for all those Fox viewers out there to swallow. But every time that they're watching Billy Crystal, well, not Billy Crystal, Bill Crystal, old Irving's son, on that, they don't realize that Irving, said that he was a Trotskyist and didn't have a bad memory about it, didn't have a regretful memory about that pedigree and all. When he went to college at New York City College and all, he ate with the Trotskyist in the
Alcove A, Alcove B.
Alcove A and Alcove B and all, while the Stalinists sat over in Alcove A. And all they did was they modified the class struggle a little bit to make the middle class, the working class that's at war with the proletariat, and they took the idea of the Fourth International, which holds that you have to keep the revolution going. There has to be a permanence to the revolution, so that momentum is not lost for communism. They took that whole Fourth International, a permanent revolution, and transformed it into the global democratic revolution that held that you have to continue exporting this kind of bizarre plebiscitary democracy that we have here to other countries.
which is kind of its Judeo-Masonic Jacobin ideology. It's really weird. It's Klaus Rin. I think he wrote a book called The New Jacobins back in the early 90s. I came across that when I was in my 20s. I read it, and it's the first notion I got of that within the American political scene. How radical they're within the conservative movement. I think it was Lawrence Wilkinson, Colin Powell's chief of staff. You provide the quote, and he says about the neocons. He says they are not neocons. They are not new conservatives. They're Jacobins. Their predecessor is the French Revolution leader Maximilien Robespierre, and to say that these people are dead, dormant, or lying quiescent is not encouraging, because there are enough of them left, and it's going to be incumbent on the rest of us in this country, at least, to watch these trends and make sure that their ugly head doesn't rise up and cause more problems in the future.
There you go. There you go. No, yeah, they were basically looking to. They came over here. They found jobs within the establishment because the establishment were looking for strategists that would help them in their back and forth struggle with the Soviet Imperium. And after the Soviet Imperium went away, they didn't go away, and they continued with their desire to universally impose a plebiscitary form of democracy, which is what Klaus G. Rins calls it, which basically totally jettisons the institution of the rule of law and makes majoritarianism the order of the day, which ultimately leads to oligarchy, because the oligarchy controls the majority through demagoguery, through the use of capitalizing, using grievances and as to gain political capital.
And they also were able to form these parallel structures. Like there was Team B that could question the CIA's official estimations regarding Soviet power.
Yeah, very important group. They're very. That was the privatization of intelligence. Should have never happened. The intelligence that those guys were getting should have never left the hands of the CIA, and yet they're giving that to Team B under. I can't remember the individual's name now. I think it was Albert Wohlstetter.
Yeah.
But and if these guys if Team B was passing it off to a foreign power, who could stop them? I mean, but the thing is that they took the same intelligence and made a gross misinterpretation of it, and
But it enriched the military-industrial complex, which turned around and funded their think tanks and their foundations.
Oh, absolutely. And in our book, where we're going to be expanding upon the whole idea of the cult of the superweapon, where we hope to show that Team B actually helped to increase the level of nuclear anxiety here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's rule by fear. Yep.
Yeah. Again, going back into that. Conditioning people to accept the idea of a world government as the only viable alternative to nuclear extinction and everything.
And you do have an interesting segment on this group, the Council for National Policy, which not many people know about. They've been very influential, and they kind of marketed themselves as the counterpoint or anti-Council for Foreign Relations, a conservative answer to the Atlanticist Council of Foreign Relations. So let's talk about the CNP for a while.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, it's important to go into them. The Council for National Policy, also known as the CNP, was founded in 1982 by the now deceased evangelical author Tim LaHaye, who wrote the Left Behind series, which is a story for another day. That was also some predictive programming, some normative fiction there that was meant to raise nuclear anxiety, and also to prevent the bomb as a kind of a salvific vehicle, because for LaHaye, the bomb was a necessary prerequisite to the second coming of Jesus Christ. If you read that series, it's just, it fits into Bible prophecy, man. You're going, if you read it the way that we read it, and all. There's going to be mushroom clouds all over the place, but be happy. That's going to bring Jesus back. Anyways.
And you can speed things up with it if you press the button.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Exactly. But, the CMP has been described by the media as a, quote, little-known club of a few hundred of the most powerful conservatives in the country, unquote, that meets 3 times a year, quote, behind closed doors at undisclosed locations for a confidential conference. I think it's journalist David K. Kirkpatrick that asserts that the CMP founders were looking to basically create this kind of conservative counterpart to the Council on Foreign Relations. And as a matter of fact, to quote him directly, he said that they were, quote, were seeking to create a Christian conservative alternative to what they believe was the liberalism of the Council on Foreign Relations, unquote. Now, we found this to be very significant, given the tremendous role that CFR members have played in the realm of deep politics, that realm where secrecy and law-breaking and criminal activities are commonplace and a part of daily business, that going right back to the beginning of this conversation. Many members of the CFR, such as, the Dulles brothers, W. Averill Harriman, Zbig Brzezinski, George H.W. Bush, and scores of others were or still are, those of them that are still alive, participants in America's deep state. And I personally think it wouldn't be inaccurate to assert that the CFR is one of the many elite combines that actually staffs the American deep state. And I mean, in other words, it's the employment center that the deep state goes to when they need employees. That's where they get their staff.
And it coordinates the academy, the academic world, the media world,
right?
Everything. It's kind of like the octopus, at least in the United States. But as you mentioned this is an outgrowth of the Institute of International Affairs, which goes back to Cecil Rhodes and his Last Will and Testament. But go ahead.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Perhaps the CFR acts in the same capacity as perhaps the CMP acts in the same capacity as the CFR. That's our contention, at least. The group, it presents itself as this alternative to the CFR and an effective bulwark to the Eastern liberal establishment. Someone who seems to have partially swallowed that line is the political scientist Joel Skousen. And you might have heard him because he's appeared on Alex Jones' show a lot. And during one appearance, Skousen actually claimed that the CMP had made considerable progress, quote, in stopping the compromises the Reagan administration was involved in under the influence of Vice President George W. Bush, unquote. So, so he basically, believed this promo that, that it was acting as an effective kind of counter group to the Eastern liberal establishment, and in particular the Eastern liberal establishment's influence on Reagan through Bush. Now, Skousen also holds that the CMP, quote, started off with real Goldwater-like Republicans trying to be more conservative with Reagan, but it quickly got, as I said, infiltrated by by establishment Republicans because these people had money, unquote. Skousen claims that following the infiltration, the CMP became a quote unquote very lackluster group. Well, when we take those quotes and we look at what he said on the Alex Jones show, Philip and I believe that Skousen is partially correct in his assessment. The fact, however, that you have individuals like Tim LaHaye, like Paul Weyrich with his Opus Dei connections, or Nelson Bunker Hunt, who actually was the sponsor with John Singlob of the Iran-Contra infamy of groups that would lead to that would basically morph into the CMP, like the Western Goals Foundation. When you look and you see individuals like that, and you see that they were among the founding members of the CMP, that suggests to us that the CMP was controlled by oligarchs and acted as an elite combine from its very inception. Skousen's contention that establishment Republicans like Bob Dole and Newt Gingrich infiltrated the CMP is true, but his interpretation of events and of the infiltration is kind of wrong. So I want to try to present what I think is a more accurate interpretation of what happened with the CMP.
Didn't its governing board also have members of the CFR on it?
I do know that there was some CFR overlap. If you look at, for instance, Edward Teller was on the, I believe he was on the board of governors. He was definitely a CMP participant. He was CFR. If you look at J. Peter Grace, he was CFR, and he also was a participant in the CMP. So it's not the two groups are not entirely separate from one another. Fighting one another. There seems to have been some overlap there, but we assert that the CMP was already acting as an elite combine at its founding in 1982.
Yes, controlled opposition.
Well, yeah. Well, at that time, it was acting as a conduit for the Southern Rim elites, which are also referred to by such writers as Kirkpatrick Sale and Carl Oglesby as the Cowboys.
Yes, basically it was the Yankees working with the Cowboys, right?
Well, yeah. Well, the Cowboys are an elite power bloc that began to emerge during World War II. Their economic and political power base began to grow when people made a huge exodus from the northeast region of the United States. Now, the northeast region of the United States is, as most of the audience probably knows, it has historically served as the Eastern liberal establishment's seat of power. Mm-hmm. And that migration we saw headed south of the 37th parallel to places like the Carolinas, north and south, like Georgia. Georgia, by the way, would produce Larry McDonald, who would head up Western Goals and would also head up the John Birch Society and was a member of the CMP, and that's why we probably see we see that the staff we see those lower level members of the John Birch Society doing some good things, but
and ending up on Flight KL 007.
Yeah. Probably with information concerning the John F. Kennedy assassination, but I guess that's the story for another day.
Well, because you mentioned Yankee Cabo, where might have been the earliest examples of them collaborating, right?
Right. Yeah, because one individual, I think his name was Trey Parker, who was part of a CIA counterintelligence group called Pegasus, said that he had heard that Larry McDonald was in the possession of tape recordings between J. Edgar Hoover, Dulles, and I believe one of the Rockefellers. I believe where they were basically discussing the assassination prior to it happening. So there you have representatives of both the Cowboys and the Yankees, right?
And
there.
Johnson was a tool of the Cowboys.
And all. Yes, he was. I'm heading in that direction too.
Okay, yeah.
But anyways, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, big chunks of Nevada and California. All of those constituted the Southern Rim. And in those states, the Southern Rim tycoons put the migrating populations to work and built these huge fortunes in the realms of electronics, of aerospace, of defense, of agribusiness. They took advantage of its its good weather, of the good transport routes for commerce there in the southern rim, its relatively protected shoreline. They took advantage of that, and they really built these huge Johnny-come-lately dynasties that the Eastern establishment dynasties would come to despise.
And it was this complex that was largely developed as a consequence of the Second World War.
Right, absolutely, yeah. Right. I mean, the war and the mobilization and the need for the need for a tremendous war machine really drove those fortunes.
Mm-hmm.
But these elites, they were, like you said, they were in a coalition with the Eastern liberal establishment. But that stayed in place until around 1968. And that's when the liberal Eastern establishment, known to many as the Yankees, began to lose faith in the idea that any kind of military victory in Vietnam was feasible. The irony is, going back to what you said, Tim, it was the cowboy president Lyndon Johnson who was manipulated into the escalation of U.S. ground involvement in Southeast Asia by Yankee holdovers from the Kennedy administration.
Mm-hmm.
Individuals like Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, those guys, the wise men, and everything. So the Yankees.
You had to bring the heroin somehow. So
yeah. Well, that's the thing. That both the Cowboys and the Yankees wanted to control the opium production in Southeast Asia that was previously monopolized by French elites and the Corsican mobs. And that's probably why you've seen this kind of support for this Eastern establishment, support for Ho Chi Minh, so that they could unseat their French competition. We didn't give them any help in I believe it was Dien Bien Phu. We didn't give them any help there, and they were asking for it. The war was getting too expensive, though, and was starting to scare off foreign investment in America. So the Yankees broke with the Cowboys and began pushing for withdrawal. And the Cowboys adopted a victory at all cost kind of platform. And so a great schism, kind of what you could compare to the Great Schism, between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox. A great schism gradually pulled the Yankees and the Cowboys, pulled their coalition to pieces. And so now I got to mention there has been some periodic revivals of the coalition, and there has been attempts to heal that rift. But the unity that was seen prior to 1968 has never really returned. And so the Cowboys...
This was the Cold War consensus.
Right. That consensus was gone and everything. The Cowboys successfully tapped into the indignation felt by conservatives and right-wing elements who correctly see the United States generally and the southwestern states specifically as victims of establishment occupation and all. Meanwhile, the Yankees, they've successfully gained control of much of the left wing. And they've done this by presenting their globalist agenda as the only viable alternative to environmental degradation, to jingoism, to racism, to intolerance, and many other problems, both real and imagined.
This would be like Rockefeller and Ford Foundation.
Right.
Stuff. Yeah.
But I guess the point to take away from this is this, that both the left and the right in America have been successfully co-opted.
Dialectics.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I'm heading that way too, with how the Hegelian dialectic has been imposed upon the culture war. The CMP was initially representative of a kind of Southern Rim co-option of the religious right and conservatism. Later, however, the CMP drew the attention of the Eastern liberal establishment, and so establishment Republicans began insinuating themselves into CMP circles in the hopes of using the group to mobilize evangelicals and conservatives behind Yankee initiatives.
And this political consciousness on the part of so many Christians in the United States would open up a vast opportunity for fundraising through direct mail.
Oh, absolutely! Like through the efforts of Richard Viguerie.
And what are his connections to the Intel community?
Oh well, Richard Viguerie actually was part of Edwin Wilson's whole network of basically the private CIA that he had set up on behalf of Ted Shackley and Ted Shackley's second in command, Tom Klein's. And
these were the victims of Carter's, was it Halloween Massacre they called it?
Yeah, the victims of the Halloween. Yeah. They were victims of the Halloween Massacre. They were effectively disenfranchised. You saw that disenfranchisement coming a lot earlier, because if you go back to, I believe, 73, 73, I believe, is the year that our ground involvement in Vietnam is officially over. 74, you have Watergate breakout, and you have all these revelations of the plumbers, of the CIA, of these dirty intelligence circles being involved in Watergate.
Mm-hmm. And Watergate appears to be a situation where, although Nixon was a beneficiary of these elites, particularly of the Pacific Rim elite, of the Southern elites, that he had somehow run afoul of these interests
Yes.
And
he had definitely. There are many. There are tapes now. There are recordings in which he said that he wanted there. I can't remember the author that brought these recordings out, but it's in a book. Oh God, I can't remember the name of the book and everything. But there are recordings where he says that he basically wants to get those guys with the CFR and with the Rand Corporation, and he's naming two major Eastern liberal establishment organs right there, mm-hmm. and everything and all, and he basically says in these White House recordings that he wants to start to crack down on the Eastern establishment, because when you say you want to go after the CFR, you're basically saying that you want to go after the Eastern establishment because that's a nexus of power for them, mm-hmm. and everything. I used to work with Philip, and I used to work with Michael Corbin, who was nationally syndicated talk show host down south of here in Colorado, and he had the show A Closer Look, which was one of the most important radio talk shows out there at the time, and he had as a legal consultant to A Closer Look. He had James Rothstein, who was he was an NYPD vice detective, and he went on to become a private investigator, and he was one of the only guys that had the brass to actually take Frank Sturgis into custody. No, but I guess that's a story for another day. But I remember when I was talking, Mike facilitated, an interview between myself and Jimmy, and I took some notes from and did an interview with him for a couple of articles that I wrote. I think about 2 or 3 articles that I wrote. One of the things that he told me, because he talked for a long time, was that Carl Schaffler, who was the police detective that basically found and arrested the plumbers, he knew, he had intelligence telling him that was going to mm-hmm. happen weeks in advance. So, like you said, this was a coup. This was a coup. This was knocking Nixon out of power because, like you said, he had run afoul of the Eastern liberal establishment.
Yeah, if you look at all the principal figures in Nixon's downfall, all have connections to intelligence. Butterfield, Alexander Butterfield, who I think revealed the existence of the tapes. Leon Jaworski, I think, goes back to intelligence. Of course, we were talking, Bob Woodward, right? ONI.
Well, yeah, Bob Woodward was naval intelligence.
And he seemed to be Bernstein's handlers. He kept Bernstein on a short leash. And of course, the editor of the Washington Post, Bradley, has a long-standing ties to intelligence. I mean, and the Washington Post itself has always been an intelligence organ. So, with the grants and all that, yeah.
And have you ever noticed that that the so-called Deep Throat wasn't revealed to be Deep Throat until he was advanced in years, 90 plus years of age, and all. Obviously, deep in the throes of dementia or Alzheimer's at worst, to where he couldn't. I mean, like it had always Woodward it had always been understood, according to Woodward, that Deep Throat was a composite of several different people. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden he puts it on the FBI guy. I can't recall his name offhand, but who's now advanced in years.
Yeah, he passed away a year or two ago. Yeah.
But my favorite is always the one Watergate burglar. The name of his book says it all. A piece of tape. The piece of tape is gone from the door and all. Okay, so that's supposed to tell you that this whole thing's been blown. It's been removed by security. Security is going to discover you're in risk of discovery. But what does he do? He puts a second piece of tape on the door.
But regarding the Vigory connection is this shows I guess the trouble with Dominionism is that the Christian activism, the Christians who are maybe in good faith trying to participate politically in what they see as to make their country a better place to live in. Are being corrupted by the presence of these characters like Vigory, who are up to their eyeballs in this Thomas Klein's and Shackley deal with the armed shipments going to, I guess this involved shipments to Iran. Also,
they put it all off on Wilson.
Yeah, Wilson. Yeah.
Wilson later, and we show this in our we talk about this a little bit in our new book that's going to come out, because believe it or not, there is some overlap there between that and the UFO phenomenon. Mm-hmm. But we actually quote the legal documents in the book where Wilson's legal counsel shows that he had no less than quote unquote 80 non-social contacts with the CIA at the time that he's doing business, selling C4 to the Libyans, doing arms deals over here, he's supposedly gone off the reservation. He's a rogue, but he's having 80 non-social contacts with the CIA. I mean, give me a break. Mm-hmm. At what point do you say, how do you spell frame up?
And you also have mentioned the characters like Oliver North and John Singlaub, who he was big into the heroin deal shipments coming out during the Vietnam War, right?
General John Singlaub worked on behalf of Vong Pao to give Vong Pao, who was the opium warlord who headed up the Hmong tribe, to give him a monopoly over opium crops. And the way that he did that was through conducting airstrikes that just blew the hell out of his competition. Mm-hmm. And everything. And then
how else are you going to fight communism?
Exactly, and everything.
But that's funny because I think Iran Contra, the backstory of Iran Contra isn't the illegal arms shipments. The sales proceeds going to the Contras. It's the fact that the CIA was caught red-handed shipping cocaine into the country.
Right.
Which no one seems to, doesn't seem to get as much press. Of course, when it does get press, the reporters who report it their careers don't turn out well. So.
Right. No, they don't. But Singlaub, it's interesting because he went on to head up the World Anti-Communist League after Roger Pearson just was a public relations disaster. I mean, an obvious, upfront Nazi eugenicist and everything. And so he was supposed to, give it a PR overhaul, and he did in the eyes of the ADL, because the ADL ended up saying, well, they they were all these things, but now they're not. After
well, the ADLs are not, ADL.
That's another story. They're with their mobster connections and everything else.
Well, that's another thing. You realize at that level, Nazis and Zionists, they all work together.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, you've entered the world.
Is these ideologies and theologies are playthings to these people.
Yeah, you've entered a world where Rafik Harari and one other individual, I can't remember his name, but Rafik Harari is a Mossad agent, and he's over here in South America working with Klaus Barbie, and everything.
Yeah.
So, you had these two Mossad agents working with the Butcher of Leon. At what point do you say that you've reached a point where it's just ideological camouflage?
Yeah. Because that goes back to the old saying. The Trotskys make the revolution, the Bronsteins pay for it. Zionism needed National Social, needed the Nazis. They needed the war to bring about the fulfillment of the Zionist project. And at some level, there was an attempt to exacerbate the conflict, the crisis.
Right.
And so they did not want. I mean, obviously, their political. This goes back to their political vision. The Zionist political vision was more important than the suffering of millions and millions of European Jews.
Absolutely. And there the Zionists found overlap with the Atlanticists, and so there was a symbiotic relationship there too, because the Atlanticists said, hey, we have to follow what Alfred Mackinder said. You can't have an alliance between Russia and Germany ever. You got to keep those two fighting one another. So let's fund Hitler over here, to basically fight against the Russians, to fight against the Soviet Union and everything. So, it's just, there's a strange, very, very strange confluence in the world when you look at it on this sub-rosa level.
When you're trying to dominate the world, it's hard to find some sort of moral consistency or principles.
Right.
It's constantly shifting alliances and it's ideologies and there's no good or bad. There's no good.
When you're looking to selectively park your moralities, there's always a parking lot somewhere.
Yeah,
and that's the way they look at it. I mean, Richard Secord found it during Iran-Contra. They asked him, they asked him because he's selling basically crap to the Contras, and that's what caused a few of them to roll over on Secord and Albert Hakim, I believe, was his partner.
Yeah,
in crime. They were selling all this defective stuff to the Contras and just making money. And he was asked by the committee when it was being investigated, and what was your motive here? Because you're making money, but you're saying that you're doing this out of patriotism. So which was it? Was it love of country or was it money? And his answer is just classic. He's like, well, can't I have two motives?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, we're in business, and the fact that you're sending in weaponry to destabilize a region in order to facilitate more business, I guess, because you destabilize, you get the need for the weapon, you create the instability, you create the fear, the justification for more intervention. At the same time, you're creating a conduit for drugs to be flown back into the country, to be sold, the proceeds of which, will go to fund more weaponry. It's like a vicious circle, and to them, it's just a business. They don't, at the same time, the cocaine's being used to destroy, parts of places like South Central LA.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's being transformed into crack and. Creating the crack epidemic.
And if you read people like the claims of Catherine Austin Fitts, this is being done to destroy neighborhoods in order to eventually gentrify the area and make money, because you can destroy the neighborhood, destroy property values, and buy up for a song and sell it as a profit. 10, 15 years later down the road.
What happens there basically is that the crime rate goes up. Mm-hmm. The people are forced out of the neighborhood. They drop their houses on the market. The market value of the house goes down, And then when things begin to subside, these rich and powerful interests go in and buy up those houses, that real estate for pennies on a dollar.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I remember Michael Rupert, who looked into this, once said, when they do this in some other country, it's called ethnic cleansing. Here in the land of political correctness, we kind of avoid that, avoid those nasty labels. I guess that only happens it's the same thing as with waterboarding. The Viet Cong were doing waterboarding. When they were waterboarding, it was called torture. When we're doing waterboarding, it's enhanced interrogation. That goes back to the whole selective morality thing of the establishment that we were talking about. But listen,
if you're going to dominate the planet, you have to be morally pragmatic.
Absolutely.
And if you're the good guys, it's okay.
Right.
You're bringing enlightenment to the world.
Yeah, your cause is just, so any and all measures and means that you use are justified by the ends that you reach.
Now, how else is the U.S. government going to promote transvestitism in Ukraine if we don't destabilize the government?
Yeah, exactly. That's sad but true, and everything. But, the CMP, going back to CMP, and what we've established thus far is basically evolved into an amalgam of elitist interests that lure in unsuspecting evangelicals and conservatives, and then recruits them to act as deep state operatives. And most of them are never the wiser. And the ideological worm on the hook that plays a pivotal role in that recruitment process is the aforementioned dominionist theology that Phil, spoke about in depth earlier. It has made a major contribution to the creation of what's been called Christian nationalism, this Christian nationalism works towards goals and aims that are not unlike those of Henry Luce, of C.D. Jackson, of the CIA, of John Courtney Murray, when they had their dealings with the Catholic Church. And David Wimhoff and E. Michael Jones have spoken at length about that again, and I can't do it justice. But all of these Eastern liberal establishment representatives sought to change the American Catholics' understanding of church-state relations so that they would accept the American ideal and ideas as good in principle. And the end result would be Catholics who subordinated their Catholicism to a loyalty to the American empire, because that's what Luce wanted. Luce made it clear that he wanted America to become an empire when he spoke of the American century. The very idea just reeked of imperial ambitions. But Christian nationalism is much the same way. It gets these evangelicals to subordinate their Christianity to the aims of the American empire, because the dominionist basically conflates the American idea and ideas with biblical principles. And that plays well to the semi-submerged oligarchy that wants to see the universal imposition of the American empire as a kind of political precedent for world government. All the political elites here have to do is equate the American imperial projects with quote unquote God's work or quote unquote doing God's will, and these evangelicals who have swallowed the dominionist line, get behind it as a result. And the neoconservative driven Bush administration played this strategy to the greatest effect. I don't know anybody that did a more effective job of doing it. The evangelicals supported the 2003 invasion of Iraq in droves. I mean, the leaders in the evangelical community presented the whole invasion to their flock as a kind of godly endeavor. And there was one notable exception to the Christian support, and that was Pope John Paul II, who seems to have seen what the invasion for what it really was. And
I think he realized that because of the Cold War, that his church, the Roman Catholic Church, had been largely suborned or compromised.
Yeah.
He might have realized that later on in life.
I think that later on he saw that the relationship between America and the Roman Catholic Church that was basically born out of a necessity to defeat the Soviet Imperium, that was a tremendously abusive relationship.
Yes.
But, I mean, and this might seem a little bit tangential, but what the hell? Some have speculated that the breaking of the church abuse scandal in the media was actually a reprisal for the Pope's opposition to the invasion. And I personally believe there might be some substance to that claim.
Well, yeah.
I
mean, the whole sexual revolution, which poisoned the well culturally for the Catholic Church, I think, because the people they draw from to become priests and within the church would be tainted by the sexual revolution. But that could later be exploited, it's compromise. That's a basic intel op right there. You morally compromise them, then you lower the boom when it's convenient.
If you want to talk about the sexual revolution and the weaponization of sex and this whole narrative that we're in right now, when the invasion was completed, U.S. forces didn't bring Christianity to Iraq as the Dominionists thought that they would, and everything. The Dominionists found themselves to be the stupid chimps and dupes that had been used because they thought that the gospel was going to be spread. Well, wrong, guys. What we exported to that region of the world was quite different. And you can find what we exported in a Newsweek article entitled Iraqi Vice. And it's a December 21st, 2003 article, and it's still up online. And it's still on the internet, and I encourage the audience to go out and look up the article for themselves and read it. But the article describes what the Iraqis call, quote, the bad side of freedom, which is the free flow of pornography that followed the invasion. See, prior to the invasion, there was, in the article's words, a quote-unquote committee in the Ministry of Culture that, quote, kept a strict watch against even mildly naughty movies, magazines, and films, unquote. After the arrival of American forces, however, places like the Abu Abdullah district, the Karada district, they just were teeming with pornographers who did their business with protection out in the open, with protection from the American military police. And if you don't mind, Tim, I'd like to read a small portion of the article that shares the state of affairs there in Iraq after the invasion for the edification of the audience. Quote, walk down the street from the market to the adult cinemas where 70 cents buys an all-day ticket, and the audience hoots in protest if a non-pornographic trailer interrupts the action. We have to compete with the satellites, says the manager of one theater, almost apologetically. A third of the country's population is estimated to have access to pornographic TV channels via satellite dish. For those who don't, enterprising dealers record the footage on video disc and sell them for a pittance. Under Saddam, this would have been an automatic 6 months in jail, says a vendor who keeps Ultra X wares in a drawer for special customers at his video shop in Baghdad's Karada district. Now, nothing will happen to us. Nothing the police are likely to do anyways. The regime's vice laws remain on the books, but they are rarely enforced. Immediately after the war, we started raids and arresting prostitutes and pimps, says Lieutenant Colonel Omar Zaid, a top cop in Abu Adalis district. But the American MPs made us release them. After that, the whores and pimps understood they had nothing to fear, unquote. So, I mean, it would cause Dominionists severe heartburn if they knew that the American invasion led to the proliferation of pornography instead of the gospel. Of course, and the astute recognized that the invasion was about control, and it wasn't about the salvation of souls. And, you know, I don't think there's a man in the Western world who hasn't experienced purity problems that are exacerbated by what appears on the internet, on the newsstands, and on cable television. I mean, and nearly all of them can appreciate pornography's role as a control mechanism, which is what you're talking about. It's a control mechanism. Porn enslaves a person to his or her passions, and then it makes the addict a slave to those who cater to those passions. And so the 2003 invasion of Iraq wasn't about spreading the gospel or saving souls. It was about expanding the American empire's control. And I know that we're getting kind of long in the tooth here, but, you know, Christian nationalism that we see coming out of the CMP, it should also be noted, and this might be food for thought and further research, you know, at a different time. It's also served another purpose, and that is that it has helped cultivate a radicalized subculture that could be used as a pretext to implement a series of plans for increased domestic militarization. Mm-hmm. And then there were plans that were going back to 1968, as a matter of fact, that were drafted and prepared by national emergency planners and the cult of counterinsurgency that exists within the deep state. And, this is all food for thought and further research, but I'll just go ahead and point out some highlights to the listening audience so that they can go out and research it themselves. There's a retired brigadier general named Albion Knight, who was a member of the CMP's Board of Governors in 1982, and he was a CMP participant in another capacity, in some other capacity as well. But he was an associate of a general by the name of Ralph Haynes, and Ralph Haynes was one of the major. He played a major role in the implementation of Operation Garden Plot back in 1968. He basically was involved in Garden Plot's implementation in Washington, D.C. And what Garden Plot was, it came on the heels of the assassination of Martin Luther King, and used the outrage over that assassination as a pretext for counterinsurgency planning. It was a plan to deal with insurgency that basically led to the imposition could lead to the imposition of martial law, and it targeted anti-war protesters. It targeted the civil rights movement, especially at a time when the civil rights movement and the anti-war protesters were starting to come together, because the establishment was absolutely terrified of that alliance. And Martin Luther King, he actually started to run afoul of the establishment when he started to protest the Vietnam War. That's really what got him in trouble with the establishment. But this counterinsurgency plan, Operation Garden Plot, exists up to the present day. It's been revised several times. I think that the last revision goes back to September 11th and everything. There are FOIA request releases of documents related to Operation Garden Plot that can be found on the internet, and Ralph Haynes was one of these individuals who was involved in its implementation, But then he had a friend by the name of deceased. Both Haynes and his friend are now deceased. But this individual by the name of Jim Ammerman, who was going about in fringe fundamentalist groups like the Kansas-based Prophecy Club back in 1998, and he gave a talk called "The Imminent Takeover of the United States," where he basically said that the United States military and law enforcement are being turned over to UN control, and that people need to pick up arms and get ready to have an armed kind of conflict with the United States government. And Ammerman, who was an Army chaplain and was also a retired Army colonel, he continued with this kind of seditionist talk right up to 2008, when he said that all of those individuals in Congress, I believe, all those individuals who were against English only as the American language should be hung for treason. Here he is. He's an associate. He's an associate of Ralph Haynes. Ammerman is former United States military, and yet he's calling for confrontation with the United States military. And Ralph Haynes happens to be one of the individuals who's part of the cult of counterinsurgency that was coming up with plans to deal with such a seditious act. So, what we see here is basically an entrapment plan where Ammerman was setting people up so that Haynes and the individuals who were involved in counterinsurgency planning could knock them down. Basically radicalizing evangelicals, radicalizing militia types, radicalizing conservatives and right of center types to basically, engage in anti-government activities.
Yeah, this was the same thing they did with SDS or the Black Panthers in the 60s.
Absolutely.
SLA, the Sinhalese Liberation Army, the same thing.
Absolutely.
Justified the creation of SWAT teams.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's an old strategy, agent provocateurs, and I think if you investigate things like Oklahoma City and PatCon, that seems to be a part of that too. There's patterns, there's a playbook to this stuff, and if you study it, you can recognize it if you're a little bit savvy and curious. It doesn't take much, and you can understand if you can aggravate the socioeconomic conditions under the right conditions. It's like setting it's like lighting a haystack. It's all create the conditions.
Yeah, but dominionism and Christian nationalism, which is just dominionism by another name, is part of the whole plan, because you got to radicalize a subculture before you have the pretext to bring about the imposition of martial law or bring about a stepped-up militarization on the continent.
Yes, and whereas traditional Orthodox Christianity would take into things like the Sermon on the Mount and considers the lilies of the field. There's sort of this, don't take politics too seriously. And the way that Christianity did spread in the first 3 centuries of its existence wasn't by taking on the Roman state. It was by conversion just through charitable acts. And that's how it spread throughout the Roman Empire, and to the point where at one point an emperor named Constantine felt politically compelled to acknowledge it, to make it the official religion. It wasn't because Christians had taken up the sword, and that's this. It is a trick. It's a trick.
Right. And as I said before, and I can't reiterate this point enough. The problem is not the fact that there are politically active Christians. The problem is not that there are Christians who make political decisions that are informed by their faith. Okay, all of that is based on this erroneous Gnostic interpretation of Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is approached by the devil, and the devil offers him the kingdoms of the world, and then the assumption is that all national governments are somehow intrinsically evil. Again, you have no etymological basis for that interpretation, because the term invoked for kingdoms is basileia, but the term for national governments in the broadest sense is Kubernetes, and Kubernetes does not appear in that particular biblical passage. Secondly, the problem with when you try to assert that the state is intrinsically evil, the problem with that assertion is that it's an inherently Gnostic assertion, because the Gnostic projects evil outside of the intangible world and onto the tangible world. And so all of a sudden, evil exudes from the very ontology of the external world. And as St. Basil the Great noted, that results in a rebound of blame to the creator, because if the created order is evil, then so is the creator who created it. And so you have this retreat into Mosatheism. And also, it's morally deficient, because you're not addressing where the real problem comes from. You're not addressing the human spirit. You're not addressing the human will, which aligns itself with evil. And evil, as the church fathers observed in most of their writings, like St. Maximus the Confessor and St. Athanasius, as they observed, evil has no place among the existent. Evil does not possess ontological being. Evil does not possess substance or form. Okay, evil is merely a tendency of the will to migrate towards non-being. God brought everything into being from non-being. Evil reverses that process and returns everything back to non-being, which is part of the trap of Gnosticism, because Gnosticism actually encourages the migration back towards non-being by encouraging the destruction of the corporeal, physical world. The problem is not really the state. The state is an impersonal agency. Its trajectory is determined by the moral agents who happen to occupy its administrative machinery. But to point towards a bureau or an agency or any sort of governmental organization and just say, it's evil, that's evil, that is as superstitious as pointing towards a black cat and saying, it's evil, don't let it cross your path. All that administrative machinery has no will of its own. The will is possessed by the moral agents who guide it. And this is where I get really, really impatient with some of the fringe fundamentalists who critique dominionism. First of all, again, they use the term dominionism with a great deal of interpretive elasticity. So do secular progressives. I mean, the term is just applied with just this ridiculous degree of elasticity, to such a point that if you happen to say, I am voting for so-and-so because so-and-so seems to be more compatible with my faith tradition, with the sacred tenets of my faith tradition, then you must be a dominionist. Well, that's not the case. That is not so. Okay. The problem is not with the state, is not with governmental machinery. The problem is with the human will and the will's alignment with evil. And something else that some of these fringe fundamentalist critics of dominionism don't take into account is that the term dominionism, that pejorative, it's a neologism that basically originated with sociology or with sociologists. Well, sociologists are not very friendly towards the Christian faith, and sociology has technocratic underpinnings, as is evidenced by its origins with Auguste Comte, who, of course, was the protege of Henri de Saint-Simon, and Auguste Comte, of course, promoted the concept of sociocracy, which is basically a theocratic order wherein social scientists act as the chief priesthood and pragmatically sculpt the faith that the masses are to follow, and the masses venerate basically humanity, the collective organism of humanity in toto as God. So it was really just another form of autotheism. And ultimately, that's what all political theory is some form of applied theology. And if you say, well, I'm not religious, I'm a secularist, that's still an applied theology. The theology that's implied is autotheism. You have basically elevated humanity as to a deific status, to the status of God. You have made yourself the ontic referent for all objective morality, and you basically embraced autotheism. So the problem is not really having one's faith inform their political decisions. The problem is when you decide that you're going to just enact some political coup and that you're going to violently co-opt the machinery of the state, and then you're going to coercively convert by the sword. That doesn't work.
See, but that's exactly what Ammerman was trying to do through his promotion of Christian nationalist and dominionist ideas at the Prophecy Club, and later in 2008 when he called for certain democratic leaders to be hung as traitors because they wouldn't promote English only as the language for the United States. He was calling for violent co-opt of the government, but the reason that it was being done this time was basically as a means of entrapment. It was
it's the same way they set up the Mujahideen to be Al Qaeda. These are proxy forces. They want fall guys.
Ammerman was basically trying to whip up anti-government zealotry among the religious right and among conservatives, and get them to basically engage in anti-government activities, so that the counterinsurgency planners within the deep state, people like his friend Ralph Haynes, would have the pretext to move and have these militaristic counterinsurgency plans put into effect.
Yeah, at the very least, just justify their budgets.
Yeah, right.
Right.
And both Ralph Haynes and Ammerman were both instrumental in the fringe fundamentalism and in the dominionist milieu. I mean, Ammerman set up the full gospel chaplaincy at the suggestion of Ralph Haynes, and both of them have a connection to the CMP through Albion Knight Jr., this brigadier general who was there right at the very beginning of the CMP in 1982, and everything.
Yeah, they're being set up. So, regarding secularization, I'll quote Chesterton. He said, "When men choose not to believe in God, they do not thereafter believe in nothing, then become capable of believing in anything." So,
yeah. If you read Eric Voegelin in The New Science of Politics, he just makes it abundantly clear that all secularism is a radical emanatism. Mm-hmm. It's really all that you've done is situated divinity within the immanent context of the collective organism of man himself. And as I said earlier, Karl Marx, who of course was a militant atheist, nevertheless he reiterated the anthropomorphic projectionism of Feuerbach, which held that God was, or the transcendent God, was really just the projection of man's finest features into a hypostatic beyond. And at the great watershed of history, man would draw that projection back into himself and be transfigured and rediscover his lost divinity. He would, in essence, become God. And that's really what communism was all about, was the apotheosis of man. And that's really what secularism is about. It's the apotheosis of man. It's the applied theology of autotheism.
What I think that we're dealing with here in this conversation is basically a Hegelian dialectic between the dominionist and the secularist. The dominionist, they envision an America that's taken back from the godless secular authorities and placed in the hands of a kind of religiously flavored group of technocrats who govern the nation according to their sola scriptura interpretation of biblical law. And they're set up in opposition to the secularists who don't recognize the church's legitimate role in human affairs, and they seek to enthrone the state as God through the universal imposition of statism. So the culture war is transformed into a Hegelian dialectic that both the cowboys and the Yankees can exploit. And like all Hegelian dialectics, the two dialectical camps share important commonalities that make their competition really farcical at best. Both the dominionist and the secularist seem to incorporate a heavy dose of technocratic ideas into their models of government, and that commonality guarantees that representative government and any genuine democratic experiment in America is effectively undermined. And the whole time that they're duking it out, I think that the excluded middle is just ignored, and the excluded middle is basically the traditional Christian concept of a confessional state, which acknowledges the valid role of both the church and the state. And so you have a balance there. It acknowledges the fact that both the secular state and the church have a valid and proper place in human affairs. And
it creates institutions that which the individual has some sort of corporate defense or representation against the cold state, the corporate state.
Right. Yeah. Well, the confessional, in the confessional state, the secular government, it's recognized as having a role in preserving law and order and maintaining national infrastructure and regulating commerce and carrying out diplomacy and other acts of statecraft. But the church is also there to preserve the moral order by informing public policy, and it plays a role in the balance of power, serving as a kind of check on the state that makes sure that the secular officials do not violate Christian social teachings. And so, the state is the body, and the church becomes the body's soul. So the state is not totally, completely soulless.
As opposed to these atomized individuals, yelping about liberty and me. And
right, exactly.
Yeah, which is
But God only knows where this Hegelian dialectic here in the United States is going to lead. But certainly, I think that it's going to eventually spell the end of representative government as we've known it.
Well, I have my opinion with the culture war is that the culture war will be won by Christianity, but it'll be won by default because it's Christian faith, specific Christian faith traditions that are pro-fertility systems, whereas, secularists, they have no problem with abortion, infanticide, homosexuality, basically sterile lifestyles. So the future belongs to the fertile, and I'm sorry, but it'll be those Christian faith traditions that encourage fertility that will inherit the future.
Even Yasser Arafat, who was a raunchy terrorist, he was a terrible man and all. He got it right when he said that the ultimate weapon of the Palestinians was the womb of the Palestinian woman, right, and everything. The same principle applies here.
Right. But also, I think that you'll see certain Christian traditions that have arose here in the West. Some of them will go by the wayside, and I'm sorry, I don't want to offend anybody in the audience, but I'm sorry, that's going to include a lot of American evangelicism, a lot of variants of the Protestant outlook, because given their sola scriptura epistemology, that approach to sacred scripture, and their rejection of the communal component of Christian life, and the importance of sacred tradition, I think that they come unmoored from any sort of overarching moral authority and any overarching interpretive authority for the understanding of Scripture, and that's why you have weirdness like fringe fundamentalism and like dominionism, and many of them have already really accepted the establishment's sterile lifestyle. There are many Protestants who have no problem with birth control, who have some of them oppose abortion, to be fair, but then they have no problem with wearing condoms and what have you.
Yeah, they don't see the connection there. Obviously there's a difference, but there's definitely a connection,
right,
between
and I think
and abortion. Yeah,
and I think
I think that it was the Lambeth Conference in 1930 that set the destruction of Protestantism in motion, when the Anglicans, for the first time ever, probably because of the influence of Marie Stopes and Margaret Singer at that point in time.
And the Rockefellers were backing her hard at that point.
Yeah. They embraced contraception only. We swear, in these selected, circumstances. Well, it was a slippery slope from there on out.
Yeah. So I think those faith traditions, which ironically hawk themselves off as anti-traditions, but those faith traditions will probably go by the wayside as well, and you'll see more of the traditional Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, traditional Catholic, probably Eastern Catholic Christianity. I think they're going to win the day. And secularism and these aberrant forms of Christianity are basically going to be bred out of existence.
Yeah, they're basically modernity wrapped up in a kind of Christian garb, and at the end of the day, it's kind of a practical atheism, because they claim to believe in God, but they've accepted all the pillars of modernity and all of the staples of modernity. And I mean, look at their quote unquote churches now and what they've devolved into, like their former their former grocery markets where they're holding rock concerts, and that's worship. Yeah. That's worship.
And even the architecture tells the story.
Yeah, I mean, like it's a dead architecture, and they're listening to groups like Casting Crowns and Jars of Clay, and which the only difference between those groups and secular groups is that secular groups are doing the music infinitely better than they are.
Yeah. You're not making Christianity better. You're making rock and roll worse.
That's what King of
the Hills. That's what the central character said. I couldn't agree more.
Christian rock. Yeah. Sorry. It's not gonna work. So. No. So, listen, thanks for spending so much time. I know we're coming close to 3 hours. Wow. Okay.
Oh, holy cow! I am sorry. I can't.
Well, no, I mean, it's fitting.
Long.
It's a fitting. It's it's a fitting for the. It's enough time for the issue. I mean, it is. So the article again. What was the article's title? Dominionism. I gotta go with my notes here again.
I wrote it so long ago, I don't even remember. Yeah, their kingdom come.
Yeah, here goes my notes here. Their kingdom come, Dominion's quest for political capital in the emergent world order. You can read that at Conspiracy Archive, correct?
Yes, sir, you can.
And you're currently, of course, your last book was The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship?
That is correct. The 2003 edition, which was released through BookSurge, the name of the company has changed since then.
Well, isn't it 2006 was the revised version, right?
Are you sure? Or 2006. God.
2000.
You know what? I just, I need to go back to the retirement home. The senility's
Don't
kicking
worry.
in.
Hey, I think Kara Quigley took 20 years to write Tragedy and Hope, so,
God willing, somewhere within this next year, we're going to have that other one done. We're going to have Invoking the Beyond.
By then, you'll read my obituary. So
yeah. So, okay. Well, listen, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tim.
So, again, I'll when I post this, I'll send you the link so you know when it's up. And I'll let you go have dinner.
Okay.
I think I think mine is cold now. No,
I apologize.
oh no! I'm just joking.